Okay, thank you, Taka. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this, even though it's a World Cup and there's a match with Argentina going on. Anyway, my little talk today is on Dewey's pragmatist philosophy and the challenge of Confucian democracy. So I want to start with a very famous quote by John Dewey. Right? Philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men. Of course, we should add, and women, yeah, or problems of human beings. Anyway, this is from The Need for Recovery of Philosophy in Dewey's middle works. What this basically says to me is that pragmatist philosophy is always grounded in real-world problems. So the real-world problem that started me on my long journey exploring Confucian democracy started in the 1980s and into the 90s. During that time, I was very troubled by a number of things that were happening around me. So in 1983, Singapore established the Institute of East Asian Philosophies for the study of Confucianism and Confucian ethics, which was introduced into the school curriculum as an elective in moral education. Right? It didn't last very long for various reasons, one of which was there actually wasn't very much student interest. But the more serious reason was it created a backlash among the non-Chinese population in Singapore. So it was stopped in 1992. At the same time, our then Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, often talked about how in public, right, his public speeches, talked about how liberal values are incompatible with Singapore culture, including its Confucian values. This sparked off a whole series of debates that included diplomats, but also academics, right? The so-called Asian values debate about the compatibility of Asian values and Western values. And liberal democracy, human rights were at the center of those debates. And of course, in 1996, Huntington's book, right, on the Clash of Civilizations, where he said that Confucian democracy is a contradiction in terms, okay, made waves around Asia. So what troubled me about this was that growing up in, I suppose, the Chinese majority society, I wasn't very sure whether we were Confucian, but I certainly didn't feel that at least Chinese values were incompatible with freedom or with democracy. So I wonder whether do Confucian societies actually have to choose between democracy and the cultural heritage? I very much want the answer to be no, because I feel that this is a false dichotomy. I don't see why Confucianism and democracy have to be mutually exclusive. But then that's just a subjective opinion or an intuition from a very limited experience of a young woman, right? So I felt that I need to find out more for myself. After all, if Confucianism is supposed to be my cultural heritage, why should I allow others to tell me what this cultural heritage is all about? Right? So began my long journey looking into this. And of course, then I discovered that actually there have been many attempts at reconciling democracy with Confucianism. It goes back more than a century. Right? But more recently, in the 1980s, many people assume that democratization is part of modernization, and that as Confucian societies developed economically, the growth of a middle class will facilitate democratization. And of course, we have examples, right? Japan certainly, South Korea, and Taiwan. And even though they're democratized, these societies remain culturally very different from the liberal democracies of the West. So if democratic East Asia can remain Confucian at the social level, it seems that the two, right, Confucianism and democracy, can at least coexist. But going beyond coexistence, Deweyan, for example, have argued that this kind of depoliticized Confucianism as a way of life, is actually better realized in the liberal democracy. Okay. However, this optimism of the 1980s, I think, lasted only a very short time, right? Through the 90s and into the new millennium, the discourse on China's rise, right, made it very clear that Confucian democracy is not going to be an inevitable product of historical and economic development in Asia. Right? In fact, Confucian ideas of meritocratic governance began to be proposed to challenge liberal democracy. So late 1990s was a time when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. Right? So it didn't start out as a reconstruction of Confucian democracy. I actually wanted to explore the relationship between ethics and politics, right, in Chinese philosophy. And my initial comparative target was actually Aristotle. But in my first term at Hawaii, I got interested in Dewey. And because of that, my whole project changed, right? And the things which were troubling me throughout the 80s about the Asian values debate and all that kind of crystallized into this project. So when I reconstruct Confucianism, my own exploration over the decades, right? One thing that I am very conscious about is that I deliberately separate the historical appropriation of Confucianism by autocratic rulers throughout the different dynasties from the teachings of Confucian texts, which I believe have enduring value. But even then, right, even just focusing on the Confucian text, there's not just one interpretation of those texts. So one might say, which Confucianism are you talking about? Okay, granted that you're not talking about the Confucianism that is the state ideology or the practices which claim to be Confucian but may or may not be Confucian, right? Even focusing on texts that could be accepted as Confucian, and there are also debates, right? So for example, do we consider only analects? I met a scholar once who said that only analects counts as true Confucianism. Or do we include all the texts, right, from Han Dynasty, various, not just the 5 Confucian classics, but also the more minor texts, as well as the Song Ming Li Xue, right up to the Qing Dynasty, right? So there's a diversity of interpretations. My own view is that there is actually no single essence of Confucianism. But whatever interpretations, whichever text you want to include, the interpretations must at least have plausible fit with the text. Okay? And the text, the analysis is certainly at the center. But I do think that there should be some flexibility for what people want to include, provided they could justify it within the tradition. Or if they want to take a really fundamentalist approach, they want to say, oh, okay, analyze and the mentions, that's it. To me, that's also fine, right? But they also have to realize that they may be arguing at cross purpose with other people who also talk about Confucianism, but are not limiting themselves to only those two texts. So for me, anyway, most of the time, I do stick to these two texts. Not because I think that all the other texts are not Confucian, but simply because, as a philosopher, I want rigorous analysis, and I can't do rigorous analysis of so many different texts. And some of the other texts, from a philosophical point of view, are really much more challenging to turn into philosophical material. Now, I think that my project, right, trying to reconstruct Confucian democracy, is a non-starter for those who actually believe that there is one correct interpretation that accurately captures Confucius' own views, the historical Confucius. Okay? Because really no Confucian text, whether it's analyzed mentions or the later text in the tradition, contain Confucius or even mentions, right? Neither of them ever made any explicit endorsement of democracy of any kind. I think Minpen has often been trotted out as at least as the Chinese form of ancient Chinese form of democracy. To me, that really doesn't count, because Minpen is only government for the people, not government by the people. So it really is very challenging trying to reconstruct a Confucian democracy. And my own approach, right, while I do value my own cultural heritage, and I think the Chinese cultural heritage has a lot to offer to the rest of the world, I'm against any kind of nostalgic reinstatement of past practices, because I think whatever the achievements of the many dynasties throughout China's history, there are also many things that are not so pleasant, especially from a women's point of view. Okay, so the search for what Confucian values could mean for contemporary life is really at the center of my project. I'm not interested in reviving all the practices, okay? some past practices and institutions may still have lessons for us, or may also be worth considering modifying for the present age, right? But certainly not everything that can be considered Confucian. I think we also have to ask the question, why democracy? In the 80s, when Fukuyama was going on about liberal democracy being the end of history, even then there were already people who disagree with him. Right? But increasingly over the decades, it became more and more clear that this is a real question. Okay? Is democracy really something so desirable? For me, the main appeal of democracy is that it is a kind of political life that offers ordinary people optimal say over their own lives so that they are not subject to other people's arbitrary decisions. But if we're thinking of democracy as a form of government, choosing which form of government you want is very complicated matters. And this question of whether or not one is dominated by others, right, which is really a freedom question, may not be the only salient factor that one has to consider. Certainly, the recent worsening crisis of Western liberal democracies is not only just about freedom, even though I think that on freedom alone, Western liberal democracies also have not lived up to the promise of the ideal of democracy. Right? But the crisis really has a lot more than just they are not living to that liberal ideal. It's failure of government in many different ways. So this kind of democracy, actual democracies in the West, right? They prioritize not just individual freedom, but actually a kind of very individualistic freedom, which I think is incompatible with Confucian social ideals, actually. And they view government as a necessary evil to be retained by institutions of representation, right? And adversarial party politics. So this kind of actual liberal democracy cannot be taken as the model for Confucian democracy, not only because it is imperfect practice, right? But some of the elements, like the kind of strong individualism that you see in some theories of liberal democracy, I think really has to be seen as incompatible with Confucianism. But what I want to stress here is also just as I separate the imperfect practice of Confucianism from the values, the enduring values in the Confucian text, I also want to emphasize that it's also important to separate the imperfect practices of democracy that you see in places like the US and other places from a specific theory and ideals of democracy. On the theories and ideals, there's also a wide range of choice. Okay? There are diverse theories of democracy. But I chose Dewey's philosophy of democracy for my attempt to reconstruct Confucian democracy, because I find that there are really some striking common ground between Confucian philosophy and Dewey's philosophy. Plus, the fact that Dewey himself was actually very critical of his own society, right? His critiques of American democracy, some of them are actually still very relevant today. So the very fact that he's critical of American democracy also makes it very clear that whatever the US may be doing wrong, right, when it comes to democracy, cannot be held against Dewey's philosophy, because his philosophy is not justifying or endorsing the actual US democracy. So what are these affinities between Dewey's philosophy and Confucian philosophy? So first of all, for Dewey, instead of the liberal neutrality, right, that government must remain neutral towards different conceptions of the good life, Dewey actually sees democracy as a moral ideal. So to him, it is a way of life. I think this fits very well with Confucianism's view of the inseparability of ethics and politics, because the Confucian ideal is also a way of life, which includes both politics and ethics. For Dewey, right, individuals are seen as social selves in the making, not atomistic selves. Right? This is particularly important because Confucianism is really not compatible with the kind of individualism that sees individuals as independent, totally independent of others. Okay? Where relationships are matters of choice, rather than you are actually embedded within the relationships that constitute your very self. Right? So Confucian view of persons as relational selves requiring cultivation also, I think, provides a good match to Dewey's conception of the individual. Then, of course, Dewey's idea of democracy itself. To him, democracy is actually the idea of community. So it definitely, even though Dewey considered himself a liberal, he certainly did not see democracy as antithetical to the social good or community. Instead, it is actually the idea of community. And of course, for Confucianism, good government is about caring for the people, both materially and ethically. So community is also central to good government. So these are the affinities. But what about the differences? Okay, I will give an exhaustive list of their differences. After all, they're separated by both time as well as culture. Okay, but there are things that from these differences, there's actually an opportunity for mutual learning. So I think Confucians, at least today's Confucians, could learn a number of things from Dewey. I just want to highlight 3 of them which are important for my purpose. Right? One is individuality as the source of creativity. Right? This is an individuality that does not imply the kind of atomistic individualism that's incompatible with Confucianism. Dewey actually rejects any kind of dualism between liberal or communitarian ideas. Right? This is a modern debate, right? That in Dewey's time, of course, this is not. This is something that is after Dewey's time. But Dewey himself would be against thinking of liberal views and communitarian views as completely mutually exclusive. Okay? So to him, individuality is still important. And of course, Dewey's politics is centered on social inquiry, right, which gives everyone affected by any issue a voice instead of being bound by decisions by those occupying certain positions or roles. Okay, and it is also against hierarchies. This is something which many Confucians disagree with me and say that if this is the case, then Dewey is also incompatible with Confucians. But we can discuss that later, but I don't see it that way. I actually think that modern Confucians need to be more wary about simply accepting that Confucian societies have to be hierarchical societies. And I think what Dewey has to say, because Dewey is not the kind of simplistic egalitarians that thinks that societies has to be completely equal in every way. That's just not viable. Okay, so Dewey's view on equality actually provide a more moderate and more nuanced approach to equality that I think is compatible with Confucian social ideals without having hierarchies. The socio-political conditions of personal freedom is power, right? This is also something important because freedom for Dewey is not the kind of negative freedom where individuals are supposed to be left to do whatever they want, right? That's not the idea of freedom for Dewey. Instead, Dewey understands freedom within the context of community, where he believes that everyone should have the resources and the ability, right, to make intelligent choices and follow their own choice. Okay, within certain limits of consideration for others, of course. What about pragmatist learning from Confucius? In the area of democratic politics, at least, I think Deweyans could appreciate more the value of tradition in maintaining community, right, if they read Confucius. Right? Not the kind of rigid, unchanging beliefs or practices, but rather the continuity of shared values and the continuity in intellectual progress. Dewey himself is not completely anti-tradition, right? Although this comes up more in his later works after he has visited China. I think he did learn from the Chinese, right, the value of tradition. So I think this is something that modern Deweyans could also do. There's also the power of ritual in governance. Okay? Rituals actually exist in all areas of life, just that we don't notice it. It's the kind of regular symbolic action that nurtures appropriate emotions and civility. It facilitates non-verbal communication. So having the right kind of rituals in political life, I think it's very important in terms of whether you have the kind of adversarial, divisive politics, or you have a more harmonious kind of politics and society that can still disagree, but the disagreement at least can be carried out in a civil manner and in a manner that pay more attention to common good rather than become a naked struggle for political power. And of course, for Confucians, leadership should be by ethical example and not just expertise. This is, of course, not to say that Deweyans actually only care about expertise, right? Although there are some interpretation of, I think, Dewey views can be very technocratic. So there should be more of a balance. Okay? The kind of more technocratically inclined Deweyans could certainly learn something from the Confucians when it comes to what leadership requires. Right? It's not just all about technical expertise, it's also about ethical examples. And of course, the most important Confucian view about harmony without conformity. Right? Within the modern context, right, it's very easy for people who see democracy as a matter of electoral politics, right, of parties contesting for power, to overlook this. And this is not something that is incompatible with Dewey. The fact that Dewey centers his political thinking on social inquiries rather than contests between parties in elections already shows that he's already halfway in agreement with Confucius' view of political life, right? That we should be aiming for harmony rather than always fighting for more power. So due to the brevity of time, I can only give a very brief outline of my own version of Confucian democracy. So just 4 points, right? So first of all, a Confucian democracy, my kind of Confucian democracy, is a community comprising persons cultivating themselves within diverse relationships. Okay. This community must give people positive freedom. It means freedom that is backed by resources, compatible with deference to the authoritative and consideration for others. So you see how I combine Dewey priorities with Confucian priorities in each of these points. And it is against inequalities that undermine the aim of personal cultivation for all and social harmony. Of course, the aim of personal cultivation for all and social harmony, this is more looking at it from the Confucian side. What is also implicit in this is that it's also against the kind of inequalities that undermine citizens' ability to have a say in what affects them. Right? That's from the democracy side. The democratic perspective, right, I think comes up more in this 4th point. Right? But this community, right, a Deweyan Confucian community, must allow participation in cooperative inquiries of relevant publics. Right? And this kind of publics, right, what they carry out are edifying. There's educational deliberation to reach mutual understanding and promote trust. Right? These are not arenas of adversarial interest-based contest or competition. When I say they are educational deliberation, it's not that they have to turn it into a lesson for everybody. No, I'm saying that the very process of discussing their common problems and how to solve their problems so that as many people's views can be taken into account as possible and as many people can benefit from the solution as possible would in itself be educational for everybody participating in it. Right? Because they will learn how to listen to others, how to take into account other people's view, how to integrate that with their own concerns, how to present their own concerns in a way that other people can see why they have a legitimate claim to make in that context. Okay, I think Professor Li Yong is here. So I want to thank him for a presentation that he made recently in Beijing, right, where he criticized pragmatic Confucian democracy, including my own theory. Right? So his presentation helped me crystallize my thought about 2 very common criticisms against my view. First is, they often say, is it Confucian? So even though I at least have a lot of respect for the Confucian text and say that it must meet the criteria of being plausible, right, and can be when referring to the Confucian text, still my interpretation has sometimes been questioned as to the way you interpret. They will say the way you interpret the Confucian text, they don't sound Confucian to me anymore. So, well, that's because there are so many different ways of understanding Confucianism. So I seldom bother to get into heated debate with people who simply want to interpret Confucianism differently. I will simply say, fine, I'm just interested in people who are not sure what to think, and who would like to find some way of reconciling Confucianism and democracy, then I hope that I can offer them a way of reading Confucian texts and also understanding democracy in a way that offer a viable option for the future. Okay. So there are people, for example, who interpret Confucianism as to do with the East Asian habits of the heart. Professor Sumun Kim, right, from City University of Hong Kong. That's his approach. That's not my approach, because as I said, I want to distinguish the enduring values from the text from practices that might be questionable. So I have already covered a lot about the contradictory textual interpretations. Now, how do I get around this issue of contradictory textual interpretations? I think it's important to make clear what my methods are. Right? My methodology starts by looking at Confucian texts not as records of very specific views of particular individuals who wrote or whose views were recorded in those texts. I actually see Confucian texts as vehicles for transmission of tradition that in fact is co-created every time somebody reads them, every time somebody writes commentaries on them. Right? So it's an evolving kind of entity. So being of that kind, since it's evolving, it adapts to new circumstances. So every time a new set of audience read the text, they will ask themselves, what does this mean? Not just what does this mean in an absolute sense, but also what does this mean for myself, for my own life? Can this offer any answers to the questions that I have about how to live my life? When you approach the text like this, right? So in some ways, you're actually co-creating the text. Of course, you should not simply put whatever you like into the mouth of Confucius, into the mouth of Mencius. After all, there are words on the text that you cannot make it mean whatever you want it to mean. Right? But there is a certain range of flexible interpretations. To make those words make sense in the contemporary world, right, requires an interpretation that can be challenged and therefore has to be defended, right, as much as possible. And I think my approach is justified by Confucius' own approach to learning, right? When he talks about the Chinese classics, for example, you could see that he also adapts ritual practice, right, in the Analects, right, in Book 9. He actually adapts ritual practice to the circumstances so that the values are preserved, right, but the forms of the practice can change. And very important, right? I mean, terms like 君子, before his time, it was a title for minor aristocracy or the son of a lord, right? But he turned it into a term for an ethical exemplar. So this is only one example of the kind of creative transformation of tradition that Confucius actually carries out. So I think at least I can justify my methodology to some extent from within the Confucian tradition. More than that, for me, there is also another criteria of defending my own interpretation, which is apart from trying to show that it is at least a plausible interpretation of the text. I also think that at the end of the day, the final judgment is the adoption by contemporary Confucian societies in practice, right, both academic and popular. So will more people come around to reading the text the way I read it? If yes, then I have succeeded. If not, then well, too bad. You know, I've enjoyed the exercise, but it will not. It has failed from that perspective. But beyond academics who engage in doing Confucian philosophy, I think more important is the society. Right? So it should have an impact in practice. So this is also where I think I am a pragmatist much more than I am a Confucian, I think. Right? Because at the end of the day, I think my philosophical orientation is always more grounded in pragmatism than in Confucianism itself. So Confucianism is a topic of interest to me, and I do value that cultural heritage. But at the end of the day, whether or not I accept Confucianism completely, actually is carried out in a very pragmatist kind of fashion. I want to see how it plays out in my own life and in other people's life, right? Rather than simply what the Confucian text tells us to do. Now, although I don't believe that there's a single essence of Confucianism, I do acknowledge a certain core of Confucian philosophy, which are also still open to interpretation, but at least they must be acknowledged as having certain content. So I just list three, right? So this is not exhaustive of the core, but the core, I think, do include these three, which are important for my project of Confucian democracy. One is the importance of personal cultivation, right? That must be available to everyone to become an exemplary person who relate to others and serve the community, right? Humanely, wisely, with integrity and ritual propriety, and also trustworthiness. Okay? And on the government side, right, I view government prioritizes the people's welfare and their personal cultivation. Right? This is the Minpen tradition. So there must be at least government for the people. Whether or not government by the people is the best way to achieve this is what the argument is all about between myself and my opponents. Now, it's well known that Confucian view of government is government by the virtuous and capable. I accept this. But the way I built my own Confucian democracy on this idea is via the route of recognizing that this view of government by the virtuous and capable is not actually about giving the right to the people who are endowed with virtue and capability. Right? The legitimacy is not about these people's right to rule. And somehow just because they are virtuous and capable, therefore they have the right to rule over others. No. The justification is that they are actually the best people to care for the people's welfare. Right? So the justification is actually service to the people, care for the people. So the Minpen is actually the justification for the government by the virtuous and capable. This is only with these people, at least the Confucians have always believed, right? It's only when these people are in power that the people's welfare will be best looked after. So it's a matter of responsibility rather than having power. The power given to the virtuous and capable is so that they can discharge their responsibility to the people. This responsibility is not only just responsibility of the government, it's also responsibility of the virtuous individual. The personal cultivation, right? Humaneness itself means care for the multitude. You cannot be a humane person if you do not care about other people, right? As many people as possible. Right? So in the ancient context, being in government is the way in which your reach to the people is the widest. You can care for the most people if you are in government. Right? So that's why there's a responsibility of the people who are virtuous to take office in order to care for the people. In modern society, of course, being in politics is not the only way. In fact, it's probably a very poor way of trying to bring benefit to more people. Right? There are many ways you can, certainly all kinds of charitable organizations, NGOs, even in ordinary people's life, right? In your working life, right? How you carry out your working life can matter to many people as well. Okay, so another criticism that has been leveled against my theory, including by Professor Lee, is to do with political institutions. And this is a criticism that has been leveled at me even by a fellow so-called pragmatist, okay? I mean, Sumon Kim himself, right, considered his own Confucian democracy pragmatic, and he complained that people like myself and my former supervisor, Roger Ames, who are philosophical, who take a philosophical approach to Confucian democracy, in fact, are not pragmatic enough. Okay, so because we, according to him, we neglect institutional alternatives. So, for example, if you compare our theories with Confucian meritocrats like Daniel Bell, these people, right? They always have all these institutional proposal, bicameral government, etc., right? But we never say anything about institutions. Okay, Professor Kim's view is that the truly pragmatic Confucian democracy must begin with political reconstruction. By political reconstruction, he meant that democratic institutions have to be first adopted by Confucian societies as having instrumental value. Okay? So because it is better at solving the social coordination problem in pluralistic society. So to him, once these democratic institutions are adopted, then they must be reconciled with the Confucian habits of the heart. Right? Then you produce a Confucian democracy. But Professor Lee then criticizes Professor Kim's view as not distinctively Confucian, right? It's not the institution. There's nothing distinctive about adopting democratic institutions from Western societies. Even if you adopt them only for instrumental value, but still, it means that your institutions are not distinctive. I myself actually think that it's quite permissible to adopt institutions from various kinds of sources, whether from modern Western societies or from traditional Confucian societies. The point is that whatever institutions you adopt from other sources, or even institutions that you invent yourself, right? The institutions must meet Confucian and democratic criteria. For those that you borrow, they will need to be modified. They cannot simply be adopted wholesale, right? As the experience of South Korea and other Confucian societies have shown, democratic institutions in Confucian societies have to be modified, right? If the Confucian habits of the heart are to continue being dominant in those societies. So my defense of the philosophical reconstruction is that as long as you require whatever institutions you adopt for Confucian democracy, you admit that they must meet Confucian and democratic criteria. These criteria have to be provided from philosophical discussions, right? Your philosophical understanding of those of Confucian texts, for example, or the democratic theories, which has a philosophical aspect to it. So for me, philosophical reconstruction and political reconstruction are not mutually exclusive, nor is it, and they do not have a specific sequence that you must first have political reconstruction, then you add philosophical reconstruction. No, I think philosophical reconstruction can come before political reconstruction. Okay, can't go into more details given the limited time. So to end, I just want to say that my own approach to reconstructing Confucian democracy is actually a very piecemeal problem approach. So over the years, I have looked at different different obstacles to democratization in Confucian societies. I mean, gender equality, for example, civil society, question of justice, right? So trying to flesh out all the different components of Confucian democracy one by one, right? Rather than offering a grand vision, right? Design a whole system of government that can be called Confucian democracy. That's not what I'm interested in. And also I feel that as a philosopher, that's not where my strength lies. I leave the institutional proposal, institutional innovation, so others who are more equipped to do that. Okay, and actually I think for the institutions of Confucian democracy, it would be best if they are actually the product of an actual experiment on the ground. But for that to happen, of course, there must be enough people, whether in civil society or in politics, who actually are attracted by the ideals of Confucian democracy itself, which I think is still very far in the offing. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Here is now a Q&A session. So any questions or comments are welcome. Professor Yong? Yong-Lee?
Yeah, he's gonna continue his attack on me.
No. I really enjoyed the talk. It's very helpful, and it helps me have a better understanding of your overall project. I mean, all those are very interesting. I'll pick up a couple of things to say. First, it's more of a comment. I'm glad that you are saying overall your Deweyan Confucian democracy is more pragmatism like oriented than Confucian oriented. It's always good to have you have this like a final say of our project? Because
Wait.
uh,
I think I need to clarify, right? So what I mean, because the way you put it, it might be misunderstood. It's not that it's more pragmatist than Confucian. I think it's very difficult to weigh, to make that kind of how many percent is pragmatism, how many percent Confucianism. What is true is that the methodology is pragmatist, right? So I started out, the methodology is pragmatist, and then I try to justify using the pragmatist methodology for Confucians by saying that Confucian himself was pragmatic in the way he understood the classics. Okay, so so in that sense, the pragmatism has priority. You see what I mean? But in terms of the ideals, the Confucian democratic ideals, is it more Confucian than Deweyan democratic? Because Dewey supplied the democratic part of the component of Confucian democracy. So of course, if I succeed, then the two should integrate in such a way that you should not be able to say, oh, you know, it has more of Dewey and then more of Confucian. But I think I don't expect my project to be 100% successful. So it's quite possible that if you look at it, it's more democratic than Confucian. If that's the case, then it is more Deweyan than Confucian.
Okay, the reason I brought up this point is one of the criticisms, objections raised by Simon Kim against you and Stephen Angle is that he categorized both of you, I think probably including Roy James, as he called a Confucian participatory Democrats. And one of the reasons for him to give you, Stephen Angle, this label is that he believes your overall project, the motivation for your overall project is Confucian rather than pragmatic. So here's one of his arguments, like the reason you endorse democracy or even the Deweyan democracy is for the sake of moral cultivation, moral growth, like to be democratically politically participating, allow people to be democratically, politically participating is because that's instrumental for you to grow to be a Junzi, right? But Kim himself disagreed, and he believes for him to be like a democratically, politically participating is because democracy itself has this second order value, like it's the best way to collaborating with each other. It's not for the sake of being a Confucian Junzi. So I want to, I just want to ask you like whether that kind of phrasing of your position is accurate, like your primary motivation for embracing like say the rights of political participation is for the sake of being like moral cultivation, like being a Confucian Junzi, or to like just the political participation itself is intrinsically good, and it has nothing to do with, I mean, it does not have to be about moral cultivation. So that's the first question I want to ask you about.
Okay. Look, the very fact that that Confucian democracy is two words, right? It's Confucian as democracy. So you have two sets of obstacles to overcome. There are the people who are for democracy who see no reason why it should be Confucian. There are people who either believe they are already Confucian or who are attracted by Confucianism, but see no reason why it should be burdened with democratic concerns. Right? So I'm always very conscious of these two sets of audience whom I'm trying to persuade. Okay? So democratic participation is definitely central to Dewey's democracy. So you cannot have a Deweyan democracy without participation. In fact, I don't think you can have a democracy without participation, although what kind of participation is up for debate. So why do I have said the kind of thing, you know, that is important for moral cultivation. This is speaking to the Confucians, right? What reasons do Confucians have to accept democratic participation? They will say, I mean, for thousands of years, right, we Confucians have never had to do this, right? In fact, it is just a burden. Why must we go around, you know, participating in inquiries and things like that, right? Let the virtuous and wise do everything for us. They are the best people to do it, right? So my answer to them would be that then you are not a true Confucian, because where is your personal cultivation? Where is your service to the people? Right? How do you develop your own ren, right? If you totally ignore public issues, right? If you don't participate in, provided you're given the chance, right? If you don't participate in the kind of public discussions that will determine at the most important, the fate of your country, or at least, you know, what kind of policies you are going to have in the neighborhood. Okay, so they're speaking to the Confucian, right? But that doesn't mean that. So I don't like the kind of thinking where it always has to be either one thing or the other, right? So saying that participation is important to cultivation and that you should do it for reasons of personal cultivation doesn't mean that participation has no other value. Of course, it could also be a good way to solve coordination problem, etc. A good way to run the government, right? A good way to make policies. Okay, you take into account as many people's views as possible, rather than having some very well-trained technocrat deciding on what's the best policy, you know, for example, to solve your traffic jam problem. Okay, even though they might actually do a very good job, right? But if they do a very good job, they may overlook certain concerns that people have that from their perspective, they may not see. Okay. So
it makes sense. It's a very quick follow-up here. So one implication of making this conceptual distinction between, like, what's the primary motivation for allowing people to do political participation is that for some Confucian meritocrats, political participation is not indispensable for moral cultivation, right? So that's why the distinction between Junzi and Xiongren can be justified, because for common people, even without the right of political participation, they can still become morally virtuous, right? Even though they cannot be, say, political virtues to be capable of running for office, right? So so Stephen Angle is pretty clear on this point. So Angle argues that political participation is indispensable. So you got to allow everyone to have the right of political participation in order to become a Junzi.
I agree.
Yeah, okay, it's good. So so then there is this follow-up objection from Salmon Kim. So he argues that Confucian meritocrats, they argue that for Junzi, political participation is indispensable. So you would allow people who have more moral virtues to have more political power, right? So he argues that if you follow Steve Angle's reasoning here, it easily collapses into the Confucian meritocrats' argument. Like at the end of the day, it's the moral virtues that's the end of all this discussion, right? Political participation is indispensable for moral cultivation. Therefore, moral cultivation is the final value, the ultimate value that decides everything.
No, I don't see how that collapses into the meritocratic solution, because personal cultivation is for everyone.
Right, but so this is like
so it's not that so for everyone, right? So everyone must cultivate themselves.
right.
But when it comes to the question of government, it doesn't mean that only virtue has value in the whole Confucian worldview. Right? Life has value too, right? Okay, I mean, respect for life, for example, right? Life is not just about virtue, right? So it cannot be the only value. I hate to hear people say that something must be the ultimate value or the only value. This is very anti-pragmatist. Right? Pragmatists don't believe in absolute single value or ends in themselves, this kind of things, okay? It's not. Life is so complex. There are many different kinds of values that one has to consider. And in different contexts, different values become important. So what is very clear, right, for Confucians, I don't think I'm distorting the Confucian, is that personal cultivation must be for everyone. So from the government's perspective, why even bother to have government, right? The idea is that given that different people have different abilities and things are complicated, everybody doing their own thing will not necessarily be best for everyone, right? So you have someone who is a ruler. The ruler's responsibility is to make everybody's life better, including providing them first of all, is their material livelihood, right? They must at least survive, right? Physically, materially. Then on top of that, they must be educated to give them the chance to cultivate themselves, right? So this is the responsibility of the government. So the value, the decision on who should govern is not determined by who has value, who has virtue, because virtue is the ultimate value. No, that's not it. The decision on who should govern is determined by who will allow the most people to enjoy a life where they have a decent livelihood and they can cultivate themselves, right? And the answer is those people who have virtue and ability. They will provide this condition for everyone else to cultivate themselves to live even a prosperous life.
Okay. So this is very good. So this will allow me to move on to the second question. So I saw there was like an inconsistency throughout your lecture on the issue of minben. So I think early on you were saying kind of political equality, and it should be a government, not just should be government for the people, but also government by the people. But I think towards the end, when you summarize your overall view of the Deweyan Confucian democracy, the last point you were saying it should be government by the virtuous and capable. That sounds very much similar to the Confucian meritocrats, right? So
let me see.
yeah, the last, I think it's the last, is that the last slide?
The outline. No,
yeah,
the outline, right?
right. So the government by the virtuous and capable. So I saw there was like an inconsistency, like right?
No, I don't see. The one where I mentioned minben was ideal government prioritizes the people's welfare and personal cultivation, right? So that's government for the people. The government by the virtuous and capable. No,
right,
this one
right.
I'm not saying that this is what the Confucian democracy is. I'm saying that I recognize that this is part of the core of Confucian philosophy. Okay, now I know where you get this. Okay, so that is part of the core of Confucian political philosophy, right? I mean, one must grant the Confucian meritocrat. That cannot be denied. Dezhen cannot be explained out of Confucianism. But I don't believe that Dezhen should result in the kind of Confucian meritocracy that they are talking about, or that it is anti-democratic, right? Because the way I see it, and this is precisely what we're discussing, right? Why is it that the Confucians believe in government by the virtuous and the capable? It's because they believe that the virtuous and capable will do the best job when it comes to caring for the people, including caring for the people's personal cultivation. So there is room for the virtuous and capable to take more responsibility within Confucian democracy. Even now within liberal democracy, meritocracy has a place, right? In the government, certainly you don't want to hire your the civil servants. Civil servants are part of the government system, right? You don't want to hire civil servants who are incapable, then everything will be in a mess. But that doesn't mean that, you know, the people will not participate in government through various kinds of institutions that made democratic participation more widespread.
Okay. So again, very quick follow-up here. I just want to have your final say on this issue. So you are basically saying equal political participation is prior to this idea government by the virtuous and capable. Like everyone should be allowed to vote and to be voted. But ideally, there is this extra principle, like the people who are
No,
voted to have public policy. Because
no.
I think like one of the three pillars of democracy, like the right of political participation, does not have this like extra condition. Like you got to be virtuously capable in order to participate.
Yes, and it shouldn't be. That should not be the criteria about.
Right.
It's a democracy. So on this point, I have to admit that Confucian democracy is more democratic than traditionally Confucian. Traditionally Confucian, if you really want to stick to the text, right? Because the traditional Confucianism doesn't have any democracy. They have government by the virtuous and capable, right? Which is a kind of, I suppose, if you want to, I still don't consider a political meritocracy, but it certainly is not democratic because you should be appointing those people who are virtuous and capable. And I think it would be very naive to think that through election you can get the virtuous and capable into power. It's not going to happen, right? All our experience tells us that will not happen. Okay, so my point is not that, right? So I'm not saying that Confucian democracy is actually incorporate government by the virtuous and capable, right, through election or any way, right? No, I'm not saying that, right? I'm saying that the virtuous and capable can contribute to government as citizens, right? Whether they get elected into government, that is very contingent, right? That is cannot be made into a criteria within Confucian democracy itself, right? Okay. So the popular participation is still what's important. Okay.
It's good. It's good. So it's good. I understand it. So you are committed to the traditional pillars of democracy. Last one.
Maybe.
Okay. Someone can ask a question, then come back to you.
I think our time is a bit limited, so I'm very sorry. Let's move on to the next question, if I may. Jason?
Yes. All right. Thank you, Sahuna. Fascinating lecture. It's I like the systematic presentation of your views and addressing various objections or criticisms from different points. I think you handled that well. I'd like to bring this back. So you've taken, of course, necessarily Dewey in the context with China, with Confucian tradition. I'd like to bring it back to a contemporary debate within America. So within America, it's become very clear to us that a democratic government doesn't mean only having public officials who are elected. Modern democracies are administrative states. We have these regulatory bodies, and they are not directly elected. So some conservatives will say, well, let's just get rid of the administrative state. And that's simply practically impossible. The administrative state is here. So the question is, how do you make the administrative state, say, compatible with democracy, and who is going to be running the administrative state? So this is where I think Confucian democracy can be helpful for Americans, because to the extent that we do have appointed officials running regulatory agencies, then we are to take into account the Confucian emphasis on a liberal moral education, the cultivation of character, habits of the heart. How do you discern and appoint the right officials? While at the same time having the public participation for the elected public official side. And this is one of the reasons why, as an American, I'm actually interested in Confucianism, but in a way that would complement or enrich the Anglo-American democratic tradition. So those just my thoughts.
Yeah. So for Dewey, democracy is a way of life, right? So one of my former teacher once said that actually for him, democracy is culture. So that's a very different take on how to go about making a society more democratic. The structures of government is one thing. Where the structures are concerned, I think you just need more decentralization. Okay, everything is just overly centralized, too much power concentrated in a few agencies, and even worse when you have a president who's becoming like a dictator, right? It's a very dangerous path to go down. But from the democracy as a way of life, right? As so many things in Dewey tends to be, it has to start with education. And I must say the US probably has really messed up when it comes to that. Right? I mean, just look at what has happened to education in America from grade school up to university. Now the universities are in a big mess. Okay, I mean, what are the priorities? Okay, at one time, even competency becomes an issue. They are not even educating the children to be numerate enough or whatever, let alone character education. And of course, apart from the formal education, there's also Dewey himself had a lot to say about the dangers of rugged individualism. That is something which was very appropriate during America's pioneer days, right? But as society evolved, right, the society really shouldn't continue to be individualistic in that way. But I'm afraid his American audience, very few either heard him or pay any attention to him. It has in fact become even more individualistic than it used to be during Dewey's time. And I think if you cannot get over this, right, if society continue to head in the direction of this kind of very rampant individualism, that has basically evolved into sheer selfishness and sometimes just the hostility towards other people in society, the incivility, right? Some of it really comes up during COVID times. It's just staggering, right? I mean, outsiders looking at those things were certainly, I'm among those who think that I'm glad I'm not living in America at this moment. I'm not even going to visit anymore, right? But of course, maybe those news is only in a few places. I hope for the sake of Americans that it's not a true, accurate reflection of what's happening all over the place in American society. Otherwise, it's a very sad state of affairs. And Dewey would certainly be very, very sad to see this. Right? We say that you people have not been listening, right? Democracy is not just about government. Okay? Democracy is about what happens in your home, what happens in the workplace, what happens in the neighborhood, right?
Right. And that's exactly what I think needs to be emphasized. So too much is we haven't been paying attention to Dewey and his view of democracy as way of life. All the discourse in America is on structure, is on bureaucracy or systems. But the question about organic culture, plant the seed and the Tao will grow, that tends to be ignored. And I think it's interesting that people from the Confucian tradition can help Americans realize this aspect about Dewey came from us as a people. And I agree very, very strongly with your criticism of American culture, education in general. There needs to be decentralization, but not this kind of extreme individualism, which people are completely uprooted from any sense of community or tradition or responsibility, duty towards others. So I think work on Confucian democracy can help Americans sort of rediscover this potential for reconstruction of our own way of life.
Yes. On a more positive note, I do think that citizens' action has not completely disappeared from the American scene. Yeah, I mean, social movements, there are still some very strong social movements where the people are not that kind of individualists. They do care about other people, and that's why they are in those kinds of they join those kinds of causes. And the fact that because America is still democratic enough that people can go into the streets and protest and make their views heard and work together on their own to try to in the interest of certain kinds of social causes, that I think is still very positive, and I hope that part of democratic life in America survives.
All right, maybe the final question. If not, I have a very brief one, if I may. So the more individualistic one may become, the more important that we listen to the Confucian meaning of harmony. And the study of harmony is very important in China, particularly thanks to Professor Deweyan. He has a lot of books on the study of harmony, or Hu Shui. Sorry about my pinyin. So I was wondering, how does Dewey or would Dewey respond to the Confucian meaning of harmony, in particular in terms of the ritual, or the ceremonial practice? I was wondering how we construct or reconstruct the ritualistic meaning of harmony between your approach to your methodology of pragmatism and Deweyan pragmatism. Like because Confucianism is embedded in a number of ceremonial practices. So, but Dewey doesn't have any particular ceremonies. So,
I have a very different understanding of Li from, I think, most people who work on Confucianism, right? They tend to think of the actual rituals. So when they say ritualistic, they're thinking about carrying out those rituals, sometimes even going back to the ritual text and trying to reproduce all those forms of behavior, right? I look at rituals in a more generic sense. To me, it's not the forms that are important. The forms, of course, if they've survived and they still work well, then by all means we can continue, right? But there are new forms of behavior that comes about. I mean, younger generations behave in very different ways, but I can tell you that their life is also regulated by Li, just a different kind of Li from us, and maybe not the kind of Li that Confucians would be approving of, because they do not embody the kind of values that Confucian Li is supposed to embody, right? Of Ren, of Yi, and all that. And also do not promote the trust and harmony that Confucian Li is supposed to promote. On the Dewey side, Dewey recognized the ritual aspect of life in when he talks about human nature, right? He says that there is instinct, there is habit, and then there is thinking. The thinking actually only comes in when things don't work. Most of the time, right, after instinct, habit is the most important. That we go through life actually governed by our habits. And what are these habits? These habits, when at the social level, these habits are in fact the rituals. How you interact with people, okay? The habitual way of interacting with people that even strangers can recognize is the way to do it. Like you shake hands, right, when you're in America. Okay, in some other places, you may put your hand together and do this, okay, etc. Right. So those are habits in Dewey's philosophy, but rituals in Confucian, from the Confucian perspective. Okay. So I think we need. So one thing which I have in the past said something, but I have not actually developed, is that I think Confucian democracy need to develop its own set of Confucian as well as democratic type of rituals, because most of the actual Confucian rituals from the past are what I call infected by the hierarchical societies of their time. Right? So they all tend to be very hierarchical. They emphasize this distance between so-called superiors and inferiors. Okay? And I don't think that's so compatible with a modern society, and certainly not the kind of Confucian democracy that I envisage. Right? But still, no society, including the ideal Confucian democracy, can get away from rituals. It's just what kind of rituals would you have? Right? So I would like the kind of rituals where you would promote trust and harmony in deference to the Confucian values, but it is less hierarchical, right? More, not completely egalitarian. At least the deference should always be deference towards people who are deference to people who are excellent rather than because of their position.
Right. Thanks for your answers. And on this note, we'd like to thank again Professor Tan's talk.
Thank you very much.